They were watching me sleep last night. I swear I saw their shadows moving across my bedroom wall. You won't believe what happened next. Watch until the end. Boston, 1907. The basement archives of Miskatonic University's library smelled of dust and forgotten things. Dim electric bulbs cast yellow pools of light between long shadows, illuminating rows of metal shelving stacked with boxes and files that hadn't been touched in decades. As the university's newest history professor, I had been granted access to these restricted archives to research my upcoming book on New England folklore. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and until 3 weeks ago, I was a rational man who believed only in what could be proven through documented evidence and scientific inquiry. Now, I'm no longer certain of anything, least of all my own sanity. It began with a simple leather-bound journal, misplaced among census records from the 1890s. The faded gold lettering on its spine read, J. Winthrop, Private Accounts. Something about the name seemed familiar, tugging at my memory. I pulled it from the shelf and opened the brittle pages. Joseph Winthrop had been a prominent Boston businessman and amateur archaeologist, known for financing several Egyptian expeditions in the 1890s. The journal documented his household affairs and personal observations from 1895 to 1899. The early entries were mundane: household expenses, social engagements, notes about his children's education. But the tone shifted dramatically after an entry dated June 17, 1895. The artifact arrived today from Cairo. Professor Harrington assures me it is authentic, a genuine relic from the tomb of a high priest of Anubis, dated approximately 1200 BCE. The hieroglyphic suggest it was used in rituals involving the passage between life and death. Margaret finds it unsettling and wishes I had not brought it into our home, but its historical significance is too great to ignore. I have placed it in my study cabinet where the children cannot reach it. The entries that followed chronicled a disturbing progression. First came mentions of unusually vivid nightmares affecting the entire household, then insomnia, with Joseph noting that his wife Margaret had not slept properly in weeks. His own handwriting deteriorated, becoming jagged and uneven. By September 2, the journal took an alarming turn. Margaret insists she sees something in our bedroom at night. A dark presence, she says, hovering at the foot of our bed, watching us sleep. I attributed it to her exhaustion, but last night I too saw it, a shadow darker than the darkness, with gleaming eyes that seemed to peer into my very soul. When I lit the lamp, it vanished, but the chill it left behind remained until morning. I fear the stories about the artifact may hold some truth. I should have closed the journal then, should have returned it to its shelf and continued with my intended research. But academic curiosity, that most dangerous of intellectual afflictions, compelled me to read on. The Winthrop family's descent into terror was methodical and merciless. Joseph described how his children, Eliza and Thomas, began screaming in the night, claiming that the Shadow Man was trying to pull something out of them while they slept. The family doctor diagnosed nervous exhaustion and prescribed various tonics and sedatives, but nothing helped. By November, Joseph wrote of consulting spiritualists, folklore experts, even a Catholic priest who reluctantly performed a blessing of their Beacon Hill home. Nothing deterred what the family had come to call the Collector, a presence that seemed to feed on them during their most vulnerable hours. Then came the entry that caused my blood to run cold. December 4th, 1895. Professor Armitage translated the remaining hieroglyphics today. The artifact is not merely a relic, but a vessel, a doorway through which an ancient entity could be summoned and bound to serve the high priest. But such bindings weaken over time. The entity now seeks new vessels, sleepers, whose souls it can gradually collect until nothing remains but an empty shell. The text speaks of how this collector cannot touch those who rest as the dead already rest, in the embrace of the sarcophagus. I have commissioned 4 coffins to be built to our measurements. Margaret thinks I have gone mad, but I see no alternative. We must sleep as the dead to escape this curse. The journal entries continued, documenting how the Winthrop family began sleeping in custom-built coffins, an act of desperation that apparently worked. Joseph reported that the nightmares ceased, the shadowy presence no longer appeared, and the family slowly began to recover their strength and sanity. The final entry, dated March 15, 1896, read simply, "We remain bound to this curse, neither living fully nor embracing death. The collector waits. Should we abandon our wooden shields for even one night, it will return. This is our existence now. God help us all." I closed the journal, my scholarly skepticism warring with a deep unease. It was a fascinating account of a family's psychological breakdown, perhaps triggered by some toxic property of an ancient artifact. A case of mass hysteria, potentially, or shared delusion. Interesting from a historical perspective, but hardly supernatural. That's what I told myself as I slipped the journal into my satchel instead of returning it to the shelf. I convinced myself I was merely borrowing it for further study, that I would document it properly and return it within a few days. That night, I dreamed of Egypt, of dark tombs and ancient priests chanting in a language I couldn't understand but somehow comprehended. They surrounded a stone sarcophagus, their voices rising as something inside it stirred. When the lid slid open, I caught a glimpse of darkness deeper than any shadow should be, forming into a vaguely humanoid shape with gleaming eyes that fixed directly on me. I awoke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. Just a dream, I told myself, influenced by the journal's disturbing contents, nothing more. But as I reached to light the lamp beside my bed, I froze. There, in the corner of my bedroom, was a darkness that seemed to absorb what little ambient light came through my window. For a brief, terrible moment, I thought I saw eyes, ancient, hungry eyes, watching me from within that unnatural shadow. When I finally managed to light the lamp with trembling hands, the corner was empty, just an ordinary shadow cast by my wardrobe. I spent the remainder of the night with every light in my small apartment burning brightly. The next morning, exhausted but determined to prove to myself that the Winthrop Journal was nothing more than the record of a family's descent into shared madness, I began researching the Winthrops in earnest. The university records and Boston's public archives confirmed the family's existence. Joseph Winthrop had indeed been a wealthy businessman with an interest in archaeology. His wife Margaret and children, Eliza and Thomas, were mentioned in various society pages. More intriguingly, I found a small newspaper article from December 1895, tucked away in the back pages of the Boston Globe. Local businessman's eccentric sleeping arrangements cause stirred Joseph Winthrop, prominent Boston merchant and supporter of the Museum of Fine Arts, has raised eyebrows among Beacon Hill society with the delivery of 4 coffin-like boxes to his residence yesterday. When questioned, Winthrop claimed they were specialized sleeping chambers designed to improve the family's health after a bout of insomnia. Doctors remain skeptical of this unusual treatment, so at least that part of the journal was corroborated. The Winthrops had indeed taken to sleeping in coffin-like structures. But what had happened to the family afterward, and what of the Egyptian artifact that supposedly triggered their ordeal? I expanded my search to museum records and found that Joseph Winthrop had donated numerous items to the Museum of Fine Arts between 1890 and 1895, but nothing matching the description of the artifact mentioned in his journal. If it existed, he had kept it or disposed of it through other means. As for the family's fate, I discovered that they had abruptly left Boston in late 1896, selling their Beacon Hill home and relocating to a remote property in western Massachusetts. The last public record I could find was a property tax assessment from 1901. After that, the Winthrops seemed to vanish from official documentation. And have you ever felt a presence watching you while you sleep? Let us know in the comments. That evening, as I returned to my apartment, fatigue settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd spent the entire day hunched over documents, and my eyes burned from straining to read faded text in poorly lit archive rooms. Yet despite my exhaustion, I dreaded the thought of sleep. I placed the Winthrop journal on my desk and stared at it, wondering if I should return it to the university archives and forget this entire matter. But academic curiosity, or perhaps something darker, kept me from doing so. Instead, I opened it again, searching for any details I might have missed about the artifact or how the Winthrops had apparently managed to keep the collector at bay. The journal mentioned Professor Armitage, who had translated the hieroglyphics. Perhaps he had left records that could shed more light on this mystery. As I flipped through the pages, a folded piece of paper slipped out from near the back of the journal, a page I had somehow missed during my initial reading. It was a letter dated January 15th, 1901, addressed to Joseph Winthrop's brother, William. Dear William, if you are reading this, then our experiment has failed, and you must know the truth so that you may protect yourself and your family. The entity that entered our home through the Ankh of Nephren-Ka cannot be destroyed, only evaded. For 5 years, we have slept within our wooden shields, finding a measure of safety, if not peace. But Margaret's health deteriorates despite our precautions. The children grow pale and listless, though they no longer wake screaming in the night. Something of our essence is still being drained, more slowly perhaps, but the process continues nonetheless. I have consulted every text, every scholar who might offer insight. There is but one solution mentioned in the ancient scrolls. The binding must be transferred to another. I cannot bring myself to inflict this curse upon anyone else, not even to save my family. We leave tomorrow for the old Miskatonic Valley, to a property far from any neighbors. There, we will build a final resting place where we can sleep eternally in our coffins, neither living nor dead, but beyond the collector's reach. Burn this letter, William. Tell no one of our fate, and should you ever feel a presence watching you as you sleep, should shadows move against the natural flow of light, seek out coffin makers without delay. Your brother, Joseph. I set the letter down, my hands trembling slightly. The rational part of my mind still insisted there must be a scientific explanation, perhaps a toxic mold in their home, or a gas leak slowly poisoning the family, causing hallucinations and paranoia. The coffins might have inadvertently removed them from the source of contamination, explaining their apparent recovery. Yet as night deepened outside my window, rational explanations felt increasingly hollow. I found myself glancing at the corners of my room, at the shadows that seemed somehow deeper than they should be. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the old apartment building, every shift of shadow as clouds passed over the moon outside my window sent my heart racing. When I did finally drift off near dawn, my dreams were fragmented and unsettling, filled with impressions of ancient tombs and watchful eyes. I awoke feeling drained, as though I had not slept at all. And on my bedside table, where I was certain I had left a glass of water, I found it empty, bone dry. Stranger still was the faint layer of dust at the bottom, dust that looked unsettlingly like the fine sand of Egyptian deserts. The following days passed in a fog of exhaustion and growing unease. Despite my fatigue, I found myself avoiding sleep, keeping the lamps burning until the early hours of the morning as I pored over my research. When sleep finally claimed me, it was shallow and fitful, plagued by dreams of ancient tombs and watching shadows. Each morning, I awoke feeling more drained than when I had gone to bed. Twice more, I found my water glass emptied and coated with that strange, fine sand. Once, I woke to discover small footprints in the dust on my bedroom floor. Not human footprints, but narrow, elongated impressions with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. I told myself there must be rational explanations. Perhaps a small animal had somehow found its way into my apartment. The sand could be ordinary dust, transformed by my increasingly anxious imagination. Yet these explanations rang hollow, even to my skeptical mind. My appearance began to suffer. Colleagues at the university commented on the dark circles beneath my eyes, my pallid complexion. I brushed off their concerns with mentions of my research keeping me up late. But the truth was far more disturbing. I was becoming afraid to sleep. On the 5th day after discovering the Winthrop journal, I decided to seek out Professor Armitage, mentioned in Joseph's writings. If he still lived, he might provide insights into the artifact and the translations he had apparently made of its hieroglyphics. University records indicated that an Edward Armitage had indeed served as Professor of Ancient Languages and Archaeology at Miskatonic from 1887 to 1901, when he had retired. Further inquiry revealed that the professor still lived, though in significantly reduced circumstances, in a small apartment in Cambridge. That afternoon, I made the journey across the Charles River to visit the elderly scholar. The building where he resided was shabby but respectable, the kind of place where academics often ended their days when university pensions proved insufficient. Professor Armitage himself answered my knock, a frail figure stooped with age, his wispy white hair forming a halo around his liver-spotted scalp. Yet his eyes were startlingly alert, a piercing blue that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "Professor Blackwood," he said, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. "I've been expecting you," I stammered in surprise. "You have? But I didn't send word ahead." No, he waved a gnarled hand dismissively. "But I knew someone would come eventually. You have the look about you. Please, come in." His apartment was small but crammed with books, papers, and artifacts that spoke of a lifetime dedicated to academic pursuit. Egyptian figurines shared shelf space with Mesopotamian clay tablets and what appeared to be South American ritual masks. The walls were hidden behind bookcases, and every surface held stacks of notebooks and journals. "You've found Winthrop's journal," he stated flatly as he lowered himself into a worn armchair, gesturing for me to take its mate across from him. "Yes," I admitted, pulling the leather-bound volume from my satchel. "How did you know?" "As I said, you have the look. The same hollowness around the eyes that Joseph developed, the same haunted expression." He sighed deeply. I had hoped the journal was lost or destroyed, that no one else would be drawn into this nightmare. "Then it's true. What he wrote about the artifact, about this entity." Armitage was silent for a long moment, studying me. Finally, he stood with effort and moved to a cabinet in the corner. From it, he withdrew a metal box, which he unlocked with a small key kept on a chain around his neck. "Before I answer, I must know how deeply you've been affected. Have you experienced unusual dreams? A sense of being watched while you sleep? Objects moved or disturbed? Unexplained exhaustion?" I nodded, a chill running down my spine at his accurate description of my experiences. "And how many nights has it been since you found the journal?" 5, I replied. He seemed to relax slightly. "Then there is still time. The collector has found you, but the binding is not yet complete." From the metal box, he withdrew a thick folder of papers. "These are my original translations and notes regarding the Ankh of Nephren-Ka, the artifact Winthrop brought back from Egypt. I kept them hidden after what happened to the Winthrops, knowing they were too dangerous to be included in the university archives." He handed me the folder with trembling hands. "The entity that torments you is ancient, predating the Egyptian civilization that eventually found ways to bind and control it." It exists in a realm adjacent to our own, able to cross over only during the vulnerable state of sleep, when the human consciousness drifts closest to its domain. What does it want? I asked, leafing through the papers, densely written notes, sketches of hieroglyphics, and translations in Armitage's precise handwriting. That feeds on human essence, what some might call the soul. It drains this essence slowly, night after night, leaving its victims hollow shells that continue to live but are empty of what makes them truly human. In ancient times, it was worshipped as an aspect of death, and the high priests found ways to direct its hunger towards sacrificial victims while protecting themselves. The professor's clinical description sent another wave of cold fear through me. And the coffins. Why did they work for the Winthrops? The entity, the collector, as Winthrop called it, is bound by certain rules. It can only feed on those in the state between wakefulness and true death. By sleeping in coffins, the Winthrops symbolically aligned themselves with the dead, confusing the entity's perception. Armitage shook his head. But it was a temporary solution at best. The coffins didn't break the connection, they merely interfered with the collector's ability to feed efficiently. What happened to them? The Winthrops? Armitage's expression darkened. After they left Boston, I visited them once at their property in the Miskatonic Valley. What I found, he paused, seeming to struggle with the memory. They were alive, technically, still sleeping in their coffins, but they were changed, withered, as if they were slowly mummifying while still breathing. Joseph recognized me, but his eyes, there was almost nothing human left in them. I felt sick. Is there no way to break this curse, to banish the entity permanently? The ancient texts mentioned only one method, transferring the binding to another, essentially passing the curse to someone else. The old professor fixed me with his penetrating gaze. Joseph refused to do this, choosing instead to isolate his family where they could harm no one else. It was the moral choice, if a terrible one. Then I'm doomed to the same fate. My voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. Not necessarily. The collector's binding requires 7 nights to complete. You've experienced 5. If you can break the connection before the 7th night, you may yet escape. How? Armitage hesitated. There is a ritual, described in the texts. It temporarily reverses the flow of energy, pushing the entity back to its own realm and sealing the passage for a time. But it requires something of great power, something that has already crossed the boundary between life and death. The Ankh, I said, understanding dawning. Winthrop's artifact. Yes, the Ankh served as the original doorway. It might serve as a lock as well, if used correctly. The professor's fingers tapped nervously on the arm of his chair. But I don't know what became of it. After I visited the Winthrop property, I never heard from Joseph again. The Ankh wasn't among the items in their home, at least not that I could find. My mind raced. And the letter, I said suddenly. Winthrop mentioned a final resting place. They were building in the Miskatonic Valley. If they took the Ankh with them, then it might still be there, Armitage finished. But finding it would mean locating their property, which was quite remote by design. And you have less than 2 days before the binding completes. I stood, filled with desperate determination. I need property records for the Miskatonic Valley circa 1901, and I'll need directions to reach it. The elderly professor studied me for a long moment, then nodded. I'll help you, I'll help. But understand this. If you fail, if the binding completes on the 7th night, you will be faced with the same choice Joseph made. Isolation in a coffin, passing the curse to another, or becoming a hollow shell for the collector to inhabit in our world. His words chilled me to the bone, but I saw no alternative. I understand. Thank you, Professor. As I turned to leave, Armitage caught my arm with surprising strength. One more thing, Professor Blackwood. The collector will sense your intentions. As the seventh night approaches, it will grow stronger, more desperate to complete the binding. You must not sleep tonight. Not for a moment. I nodded grimly and departed, my mind already racing with preparations for the journey ahead. True to his word, Armitage used his connections to locate records of the Winthrop property, a parcel of land deep in the wooded hills of the Miskatonic Valley, some 60 miles west of Boston. The deed, transferred to Joseph Winthrop's name in late 1896, described it only as the Old Whately Place, with boundaries marked by a circle of standing stones of pre-colonial origin. By late afternoon, I had procured a motorcar and supplies for the journey. The prospect of driving into the remote countryside with night approaching filled me with dread, but the alternative, remaining in my apartment for another night, seemed far worse. As I packed my satchel, I caught a glimpse of movement in my bedroom mirror. Just for an instant, I saw not my own reflection, but a gaunt, ancient face with hollow eyes and a wide, hungry grin. When I blinked, it was gone, replaced by my own haggard features. And you? Have you ever seen something unexplainable in a mirror? Tell us in the comments. The sun was already low in the sky when I set out, guiding the motorcar through Boston's crowded streets and then west, along increasingly rural roads. Professor Armitage's directions were detailed but referenced landmarks that had likely changed in the decades since he'd last made the journey. As darkness fell, I found myself on a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest, the headlamps of the motorcar casting eerie, shifting shadows among the trees. My eyelids grew heavy, despite my determination to remain awake. More than once, I caught myself nodding off and jerked back to awareness, heart pounding, certain that I had glimpsed dark shapes moving at the edge of the headlamps. Reach. It was nearly midnight when I finally spotted what must have been the circle of standing stones mentioned in the property description. Ancient, weathered monoliths that predated European settlement, arranged in a rough circle around a clearing visible just off the road. Beyond them, barely discernible in the darkness, stood a house, or what remained of one. I parked the motorcar and approached cautiously, electric torch in hand. The Winthrop house was a sprawling Victorian structure, built in the ornate style of the previous century, but now showing clear signs of abandonment. Vines crawled up its walls, and several windows were broken. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges. Steeling myself, I entered. The interior was in disarray, with furniture overturned and papers scattered across the floor. Dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed for years, except for the small tracks of animals. But there were no coffins visible, no sign of the Winthrop family themselves. I moved from room to room, my torch beam cutting through the darkness, revealing scenes of long abandonment. In what appeared to have been Joseph's study, bookshelves had been emptied, their contents either removed or strewn across the floor. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface bare, except for a thick layer of dust. On impulse, I checked the desk drawers. Most were empty, but in the bottom drawer, I found a leather-bound book similar to Joseph's journal, but much older, its pages brittle with age. Opening it carefully, I saw that it contained hand-drawn maps of the property, including notations of underground features, a cellar or crypt of some kind extending beneath the house and the surrounding grounds. According to the map, the entrance to this subterranean complex was concealed behind a false wall in the pantry. Following the diagram, I made my way to the kitchen and located the pantry, a small room with shelves that had once held preserved foods but now stood empty. The false wall was cleverly designed but had warped with age and humidity, making its outline visible. With some effort, I managed to push it aside, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was cold and stale, carrying a faint, unidentifiable odor that made me recoil instinctively. For a moment, I hesitated at the top of the stairs, the torch beam seeming feeble against the profound darkness below. A sound from behind made me turn, a soft scraping like fabric brushing against wood. The pantry was empty, but I could have sworn I saw a shadow move in the kitchen beyond, a darkness deeper than the surrounding gloom. I had no choice but to descend. Whatever waited in the cellar below, it couldn't be worse than what pursued me from above. Taking a deep breath of the musty air, I began to make my way down the stone steps, one hand trailing along the damp wall for balance. The staircase descended much deeper than I expected, suggesting that whatever waited below wasn't merely a cellar, but something far more extensive. After what seemed like 100 steps, I reached level ground, a stone floor covered with a thin film of water that reflected my torch beam in distorted patterns. The space opened into a large chamber with a high, vaulted ceiling, and there, arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room, stood 4 coffins, precisely as Joseph had described in his journal. They were beautifully crafted of dark wood, polished to a high shine despite the years of abandonment. Each bore a silver nameplate: Joseph, Sir, Margaret, Eliza, and Thomas Winthrop. With growing dread, I approached the circle of coffins. They were closed, their lids heavy and ornate. What remained of the Winthrop family might still lie within, though after nearly a decade I expected only bones. But the coffins were not what I sought. According to Armitage's notes, the Ankh of Nephren-Ka would be needed to perform the ritual that might free me from the collector's grasp. I swept my torch beam around the chamber, searching for any sign of the artifact. Beyond the circle of coffins stood a stone altar, its surface carved with hieroglyphics similar to those in Armitage's sketches. And upon it rested a small object that gleamed dully in the torchlight, a cross-shaped amulet with a loop at the top. The ancient Egyptian symbol of life, the Ankh of Nephren-Ka. I had found it. As I moved toward the altar, a cold dread settled over me. The coffins were arranged between me and the altar, forming a barrier I would have to pass to reach the Ankh. Something told me that crossing that circle would be dangerous, that the boundary it formed was significant in ways I didn't yet understand. But time was running short. Dawn would come soon, and with it, my 6th day since finding the journal. I had only one more night before the binding would be complete. I had to take the risk. Taking a deep breath, I stepped between 2 of the coffins, crossing the invisible line of their circle. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The water on the floor rippled outward from where I stood, and the air grew suddenly intensely cold. My breath fogged before me, and the torch flickered as if in a strong wind, though the air was still. And from within each coffin came a soft, scratching sound, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood from the inside. I stood frozen between the coffins, the scratching sounds growing more insistent around me. My instincts screamed at me to flee, to scramble back across the boundary I had just violated. But the Ankh lay just a few steps away on the stone altar, my only hope of breaking the collector's hold. Gathering what courage remained to me, I lunged forward, crossing the rest of the distance to the altar in 3 desperate strides. As my fingers closed around the Ankh, the scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that felt somehow worse. The artifact was heavier than its size suggested, made of some dark metal that absorbed rather than reflected the beam of my torch. Hieroglyphics covered its surface, matching the sketches in Armitage's notes. The loop at the top, the part that represented eternal life in Egyptian symbolism, seemed to vibrate slightly against my palm, as if containing some restless energy. With the Ankh clutched tightly in my hand, I turned back toward the circle of coffins. To my horror, the lids were now moving, sliding slowly aside with a grating sound of wood against wood. No human force could be moving them. They were far too heavy, and from the layer of dust that had covered them, it was clear they hadn't been disturbed in years. yet they continued to open, inch by inch, revealing darkness within. I had no desire to see what might emerge. Clutching the Ankh to my chest, I sprinted back across the circle, half expecting ghostly hands to reach out and grab me. Nothing did, but as I crossed the boundary, I felt a sensation like cobwebs brushing against my face and arms, intangible but unmistakably present. I didn't stop running until I reached the stone staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time, despite the risk of falling in the darkness. Behind me, from the chamber below, came a sound that chilled my blood. Not footsteps, but a dry, sliding noise, like something being dragged across stone. By the time I emerged from the hidden entrance into the pantry, dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the broken windows of the abandoned house. I slammed the false wall back into place, then fled the house entirely, not stopping until I reached my motor car. Only then did I allow myself to examine the Ankh more carefully. In the growing daylight, I could see that it was crafted of a strange, iridescent black metal that seemed to shift and flow beneath its surface. The hieroglyphics stood out in sharp relief, somehow more defined than they should have been, as if carved into reality itself rather than merely into metal. According to Armitage's notes, this Ankh had been used by the high priests of Anubis to communicate with entities from beyond the veil of death. It had served as both a doorway and a vessel, allowing the priests to direct the collector's hunger towards sacrificial victims while protecting themselves from its appetite. But the connection worked both ways. The Ankh could open the door, or it could close it, if used correctly in a ritual that Armitage had translated from the ancient texts. The ritual would need to be performed at the moment of sunset on the 7th day after the collector had first marked me, tomorrow evening. Until then, I would need to resist sleep at all costs, as each moment of unconsciousness would strengthen the entity's hold. I started the motor car and began the long journey back to Boston, fighting exhaustion every mile of the way. Twice, I nearly drove off the road, jerking awake just in time to correct my course. The Ankh lay on the seat beside me, and more than once I thought I saw it move slightly of its own accord, the loop seeming to point like a compass needle toward some unseen destination. By mid-afternoon, I reached Cambridge and made my way directly to Professor Armitage's apartment. The elderly scholar answered my knock, looking even more frail than before, his eyes widening at the sight of the Ankh in my hands. "You found it," he whispered, ushering me inside. I hardly dared hope. "In a chamber beneath the Winthrop house," I confirmed, setting the artifact carefully on a table. "It drew along with 4 coffins, arranged in a circle." Armitage's face paled. "Were they occupied?" "I don't know," I admitted. The lids began to open as I took the Ankh. I didn't stay to see what might emerge. A wise decision. The professor leaned closer to examine the Ankh, careful not to touch it. "Of the Winthrops, spirits may be bound to that place now, trapped between life and death, just as the collector itself is trapped between worlds." "Can this truly break its hold on me?" I asked, gesturing to the artifact. "If used correctly, yes." Armitage retrieved his folder of notes. "The ritual must be performed at sunset on the 7th day. You will need to draw a protective circle using specific materials: salt, grave dirt, powdered silver, and..." He hesitated. "A personal item from someone who has died." "What kind of personal item?" "Something they touched often in life. Something that would retain an impression of their essence." He looked at me gravely. "It creates a barrier that the collector cannot cross, as it mimics the boundary between life and death." I thought of my father's pocket watch, which I had carried since his passing 5 years earlier. It would have to serve. Within this circle, you must place the Ankh on a surface of stone, ideally one that has never been worked by human hands, a natural boulder or flat rock. As the sun sets, you must recite this invocation. He handed me a page of his notes, covered in phonetically spelled Egyptian phrases. The words channel the energy of the setting sun, the daily death of light, to temporarily reverse the flow between worlds, pushing the collector back and sealing the passage. I studied the invocation, trying to commit the unfamiliar sounds to memory. And if I succeed, if you succeed, the binding will be broken. The collector will be banished back to its own realm and sealed there until someone else is foolish enough to use the Ankh as a doorway. Armitage fixed me with a stern gaze. Which is why the artifact must be secured afterward. It cannot be destroyed. It exists simultaneously in multiple realms, but it can be hidden where no one will find it. I'll bury it, I promised, somewhere remote. Good. The professor slumped slightly in his chair, seeming to age before my eyes. Now you must prepare for the ritual, and you must stay awake until then. The collector will be growing stronger, more desperate to complete the binding before you can perform the ritual. It will try to lull you to sleep. As if his words had summoned it, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. I hadn't slept properly in days, and the drive to and from the Winthrop property had drained what little energy I had left. My eyelids felt like lead weights. I have something that might help. Armitage shuffled to a cabinet and returned with a small bottle of dark liquid. An herbal stimulant from South America. It will keep you alert through the night. But be warned, it may cause heightened sensitivity to certain perceptions. I accepted the bottle gratefully. Thank you, Professor, for everything. Don't thank me yet, young man. The most difficult part still lies ahead. He walked me to the door. Remember, the ritual must begin exactly at sunset, not a moment before or after. And once you begin, you must not break the circle, no matter what you see or hear. With those ominous words ringing in my ears, I departed, the Ankh wrapped carefully in cloth and tucked inside my satchel. I needed to gather the remaining items for the ritual and find a suitable location to perform it. The hours seemed to crawl by, yet simultaneously race past with terrifying speed. I purchased salt and silver powder from an apothecary, claiming they were for a scientific experiment. Grave dirt proved more challenging, but I eventually gathered some from a small cemetery near the university, feeling like a grave robber despite taking only a handful of soil from atop an old burial. Finding an appropriate stone for the ritual was most difficult of all. Boston was a thoroughly developed city, with few natural rock formations left undisturbed. Eventually, I remembered a small public garden near the Charles River that featured a large glacial boulder, deposited there millennia ago, and left largely in its natural state. The garden would be deserted after dark, and the boulder was positioned away from the main paths it would have to do. As evening approached, I made my way there, carrying my satchel with the ritual components. The effects of Armitage's stimulant had begun to wear off, and despite taking another dose, fatigue pulled at me like a physical weight. Worse, I had begun to see things from the corner of my eye, darting shadows that vanished when I turned to look, and occasionally, just at the edge of my vision, a tall, emaciated figure watching me with hungry eyes. The collector was growing bolder, manifesting even in daylight now. Time was running out. I reached the garden an hour before sunset, giving myself ample time to prepare. The boulder stood in a small clearing, surrounded by shrubs that would provide some privacy. I began by carefully measuring out a circle around it, using a piece of string to ensure it was perfect. Then I mixed the salt, grave dirt and powdered silver in the proportions Armitage had specified, and slowly poured the mixture along the line I had marked, completing the protective barrier. Next, I placed my father's pocket watch at the northernmost point of the circle. The gold case gleamed in the fading sunlight, the inscription on the back, "To Jonathan, with love eternal." A poignant reminder of what I stood to lose if I failed. Not just my life, but my very essence, the core of who I was. Finally, I unwrapped the Ankh and placed it carefully on the flat surface of the boulder. In the reddish light of the setting sun, the hieroglyphics seemed to move, shifting and rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. The sun touched the horizon. It was time. I stepped into the circle, holding Armitage's notes, and began to recite the invocation. The unfamiliar words felt strange on my tongue, but I forced myself to pronounce each syllable carefully, remembering the professor's warning about precision. As I spoke, the air within the circle grew noticeably colder. My breath fogged before me despite the mild spring evening. The Ankh began to vibrate audibly against the stone, producing a high, keening sound that set my teeth on edge. Darkness fell rapidly as the sun sank below the horizon, but a strange illumination remained within the circle, a faint blue-white glow that emanated from the Ankh itself, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I continued the invocation, my voice growing stronger as I found the rhythm of the ancient words. The Ankh's vibration intensified, and the metal began to change color, shifting from black to a deep, blood red that pulsed like a heartbeat. And then I felt it. A presence in the circle with me, not visible, but undeniably there. A weight in the air, a pressure against my skin. The collector had come. It circled me like a predator, invisible but palpable. Cold spots moved around the perimeter of the circle, testing the barrier, seeking a way in. I kept reciting, though my voice now trembled with fear. Suddenly, the pressure increased tenfold. The air before me shimmered and distorted, and within that distortion I caught glimpses of a form, tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to be all hollow eyes and gaping mouth. It reached for me with skeletal fingers that ended in points rather than nails, but the barrier held. The spectral hand could not cross the line of mixed elements. A sound of frustration filled the air, not heard with my ears, but felt in my bones, a vibration of ancient hunger denied. I was nearing the end of the invocation now, the final phrases that would seal the passage and break the binding. The entity seemed to sense this, its attacks on the barrier growing more frenzied. The circle of salt and silver trembled, but did not break. I spoke the final words just as full darkness descended, the last syllable coinciding with the moment of complete sunset. The Ankh flared with blinding light, then cracked down the middle with a sound like a thunderclap. The pressure vanished instantly. The cold spots disappeared. The presence that had been circling me was gone, banished back to its own realm. For a moment, I stood trembling in the circle, scarcely daring to believe it had worked. Then exhaustion overcame me, and I sank to my knees beside the boulder. The Ankh lay in two pieces now, its power apparently spent in the ritual. And have you ever sensed an unseen presence watching you? Share your experience in the comments. I must have passed out briefly, for the next thing I knew, I was lying on the ground, the night fully dark around me. Panic seized me. Had I failed? Had the collector claimed me while I was unconscious? But the oppressive dread that had haunted me for days was gone. I felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from my soul. The ritual had worked. I was free. I gathered the broken pieces of the Ankh and the remnants of the ritual components, determined to leave no trace of what had occurred. As Armitage had instructed, the Ankh would need to be hidden where it could never be found and used again. As I bent to collect my father's pocket watch from the northern point of the circle, I noticed something unsettling. The gold case, which had been polished and gleaming before the ritual, now looked tarnished and dull. The inscription was faded, barely legible, as if decades of wear had occurred in a single night. More disturbing still, when I opened it, the watch had stopped at precisely the moment of sunset, 7:42 p.m. The second hand trembled slightly but would not move, no matter how many times I wound the mechanism. Something of the ritual's power had affected it, perhaps even drawn upon the lingering essence of my father that it contained. The thought was both comforting and disturbing. Had the ritual used some part of him to help banish the entity? And if so, what did that mean for his eternal rest? Questions for another time. For now, I needed to secure the broken Ankh and then, at long last, allow myself to truly sleep without fear. I left the garden and made my way back to my apartment. The night air cool and refreshing against my face. For the first time in days, the shadows seemed ordinary, containing nothing more menacing than darkness. My apartment, too, felt normal again. Just a small, somewhat cluttered academic's residence, not the hunting ground of an ancient entity. I placed the pieces of the Ankh in a metal box, which I locked and set aside. Tomorrow, I would take it far from the city and bury it where none would think to look. I prepared for bed with a profound sense of relief, my body crying out for the sleep it had been denied. As I changed into my nightclothes, I caught sight of my reflection in the bedroom mirror and paused. Something was different. My face was my own, but somehow changed. My eyes seemed deeper set, the shadows beneath them more pronounced than mere fatigue could explain, and my skin had a grayish pallor that hadn't been there before. I leaned closer to the mirror, examining these subtle alterations. Was this simply the result of my ordeal, the physical toll of days without proper sleep? As I studied my reflection, I noticed something else, a faint outline behind me, a suggestion of a tall, thin figure standing just over my shoulder. I whirled around, but my bedroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection smiled at me. Not a warm smile of relief, but a cold, knowing smirk that I had not formed with my own lips. And as I watched, frozen in renewed horror, my reflection winked. I stumbled backward from the mirror, my heart hammering against my ribs. This couldn't be happening. The ritual had worked. I had felt the collector vanish, had felt the oppressive weight of its presence disappear, and yet my reflection remained in the mirror, still smirking, though I had moved away. It tilted its head curiously, studying me as I might study an interesting specimen in a laboratory. "No," I whispered. "This isn't possible." My reflection's smirk widened into a grin that stretched too far across its face. Its eyes, my eyes, yet not, gleamed with an ancient hunger. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one finger to its lips in a gesture of silence. Then the image rippled like a stone thrown into still water and settled back into a normal reflection that copied my horrified posture exactly. I fled the bedroom, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste. In the small living room, I paced frantically, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Had the ritual failed? Had I misunderstood some crucial element? Or worse, had it worked exactly as intended, but with consequences I hadn't foreseen? I needed to speak with Armitage again. The elderly professor had warned me about the ritual's dangers, but perhaps he knew more than he had initially shared. It was late, well past midnight, but this couldn't wait until morning. I dressed quickly, avoiding looking at any reflective surfaces, and made my way back to Cambridge. The lights were still on in Armitage's apartment, visible through the thin curtains covering his windows. He answered my knock, looking haggard, as if he too had been unable to rest. "Professor Blackwood," he said, stepping back to allow me entry. "I take it you performed the ritual?" "Yes, and it seemed to work. The entity vanished. But afterward," I hesitated, suddenly aware of how mad I would sound. "My reflection, it's no longer mine." Armitage's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "Show me." He led me to a small mirror hanging in his entryway. I approached it reluctantly, half expecting to see the grotesque grin again. But my reflection appeared normal, mimicking my movements perfectly. "I swear it happened," I insisted. My reflection moved independently. It smiled at me, a horrible, inhuman smile, and then winked. Armitage studied me intently, his piercing blue eyes searching my face. The Ankh. You said it broke during the ritual. Yes, split right down the middle. And where are the pieces now? In a metal box in my apartment. I was planning to bury them tomorrow. The professor nodded slowly. I feared this might happen. The texts weren't entirely clear about the ritual's outcome. He moved to his cluttered desk and shuffled through papers until he found what he was seeking. Here, this passage. I translated it as, "The opener becomes the seal," assuming it meant the Ankh itself would seal the passage. But an alternative translation could be, "The opener becomes the sealed." A chill ran down my spine. What are you suggesting? The Ankh was the doorway through which the collector entered our world. When it broke, that doorway needed a new vessel, something to contain the path between worlds. His eyes met mine, filled with pity. I believe that vessel is now you, or more specifically, your reflection. That's impossible, I protested. A reflection isn't a physical thing, it's just light bouncing off a surface. To our modern understanding, yes. But in the metaphysics of ancient Egypt, reflections were considered a part of the soul, the Ka or life force. They believed mirrors didn't just reflect light, but essence. Armitage sighed heavily. I think when the Ankh broke, the pathway it contained transferred to your reflection. Your Ka has become the new doorway. Then the collector is still linked to me. It can still reach me through mirrors. Not exactly. The ritual did banish the entity back to its realm. The binding is broken, but the passage remains, now sealed within your reflection. Your Ka has become a barrier between worlds, preventing the collector from crossing over again. I struggled to comprehend what he was saying. So my reflection is, what, possessed? A prison for this pathway between worlds. In essence, yes, it exists now in both realms simultaneously, here and in the collector's domain. That's why it can move independently of you. Part of it is no longer entirely yours. How do I fix this? How do I get my reflection back? Armitage's silence was answer enough. And there must be something, I insisted. Some other ritual, some way to transfer the passage back to the Ankh, or to destroy it entirely. The ancient texts don't mention any way to reverse this process. Once a doorway is created between worlds, it cannot be uncreated, only contained or relocated. He placed a hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry, Professor Blackwood. I truly am. But consider this. As unsettling as your situation is, it's far better than the alternative. Had the ritual failed completely, the collector would now be wearing your body like a suit, while your essence was trapped in its realm, being slowly devoured for eternity. His words provided little comfort. So I'm just supposed to live with this, with a reflection that isn't mine, that might be watching me from every mirror, every window, every pool of water. For now, yes, but I'll continue researching. Perhaps there's something in the texts I've overlooked, some clue to a more permanent solution. He hesitated. In the meantime, you might consider limiting your exposure to reflective surfaces. I left Armitage's apartment with a profound sense of dread that even the cool night air couldn't dispel. The collector might be banished, but part of its realm remained connected to me through my reflection, my fractured Ka. As I walked back toward my own neighborhood, I found myself avoiding shop windows, puddles on the street, anything that might show me the thing that was no longer entirely my reflection. The world suddenly seemed full of treacherous surfaces, waiting to reveal the horror my image had become. When I finally returned to my apartment, exhaustion overwhelmed me. Despite my fear, I couldn't fight sleep any longer. I covered the bedroom mirror with a sheet, checked that the bathroom door was firmly closed, and collapsed fully clothed onto my bed. Sleep came instantly, but it brought no peace. My dreams were fractured, disjointed, scenes from my life viewed as if through a warped mirror. In each fragment, I saw myself from outside, but the self I observed was subtly wrong. The eyes too hungry, the smile too wide, the movements too fluid, as if my dream self was being puppeteered by something that didn't quite understand human limitations. I awoke to bright morning sunlight streaming through my window. For a blissful moment, the events of the previous days seemed like nothing more than an elaborate nightmare. Then I noticed the sheet covering my bedroom mirror had fallen or been removed during the night. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned to face it. My reflection stood waiting, perfectly mimicking my posture and expression. When I raised my hand, it raised its hand. When I tilted my head, it tilted its head. Perfectly synchronized, perfectly normal, but its eyes told a different story. Behind that mirrored gaze lurked something ancient and patient, something that had existed in the spaces between worlds for millennia. It watched me from within my own reflection, bound now to the surface of mirrors, unable to cross over but ever present. I dressed quickly and left the apartment, the broken pieces of the Ankh secured in their metal box. Whatever had happened to my reflection, I still needed to ensure the artifact itself was safely hidden. I took a train west, riding for hours until I reached a remote area of woodland, far from any settlement. There, I hiked deep into the forest until I found a suitable spot, a clearing unmarked by human presence, the ground soft enough to dig. As I buried the metal box containing the broken Ankh, I sensed a subtle shift in the air around me. Not the oppressive presence of the collector, but something else, a feeling of alignment, as if pieces of a complex puzzle were falling into place. Perhaps by returning the Ankh to the earth, I was completing some part of an ancient cycle that had begun when Joseph Winthrop first brought the artifact from Egypt. Over the following weeks, I adjusted to my new reality as best I could. I removed or covered most of the mirrors in my apartment, keeping only a small shaving mirror that I used briefly each morning. Even this limited exposure was unsettling. My reflection obeyed the laws of physics perfectly, yet somehow conveyed the impression of something waiting, watching, contained, but ever present. I consulted with Armitage regularly, but his research yielded no solution to my predicament. The ancient Egyptians had apparently never envisioned, or at least never recorded, a way to completely close a doorway once opened. The best one could hope for was to seal it within a vessel, as had been done with the Ankh, and now with my reflection. Think of it as a form of symbiosis, Armitage suggested during one of our discussions. But your reflection contains the pathway, preventing the collector from crossing over. In return, it remains connected to our world through you. But for how long? I asked. What happens when I die? Will it be released? The professor had no answer to that troubling question. As months passed, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I required less sleep than before, and when I did sleep, my dreams were vivid and often took place in landscapes that couldn't possibly exist in our world. Cities of impossible geometry beneath skies of shifting colors, populated by beings glimpsed only from the corner of the eye. I found I could sense reflective surfaces even without seeing them, a kind of awareness of potential windows where my altered K might manifest. Sometimes, in crowds, I would catch strangers staring at me with momentary confusion, as if they had seen something unusual in a shop window or a puddle as I passed by. Most disturbing of all, I occasionally experienced brief moments when I felt as if I were observing myself from outside my body, seeing through the eyes of my reflection as it looked out from a mirror at my physical form. These episodes lasted only seconds, but left me disoriented and questioning the boundaries of my own identity. Was I still fully myself, or was I slowly merging with the entity on the other side of the glass? 1 year after the ritual, I received a letter informing me of Professor Armitage's passing. He had died peacefully in his sleep, the letter said, but had left specific instructions regarding certain papers that were to be delivered to me. These arrived a week later. His complete notes on the collector, the Ankh, and the ritual, along with new translations he had been working on until his death. Among them was a passage he had apparently only recently deciphered. The vessel that contains the pathway between worlds becomes neither fully of one realm nor the other. In time, the vessel itself may learn to traverse the boundary it contains, to walk between worlds as the high priests once did. But beware, for to walk in the realm of the collector is to become as it is, to feed as it feeds, to hunger as it hungers. I set the papers down, my hands trembling slightly. Was this to be my fate? To eventually gain the ability to cross between worlds, but at the cost of becoming something like the collector itself. That night, standing before the small shaving mirror I still kept, I studied my reflection more carefully than I had dared to in months. It matched my movements perfectly, its face a flawless copy of my own. Yet something in its eyes, my eyes, had changed. They seemed deeper somehow, containing vistas that stretched far beyond the physical confines of my small apartment. "What are we becoming?" I whispered to my reflection. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, my reflection's lips curved into a smile that I was not forming. It leaned slightly forward, as if pressing against the inside of the glass, and whispered back in a voice that was mine, yet not mine. Something wonderful. It reached out a hand, palm flat against the inside of the mirror. Without conscious decision, I found my own hand rising to meet it, pressing against the cool glass from my side. For a breathtaking moment, I felt the solid surface of the mirror become permeable, my fingertips meeting my reflection's fingertips in a space that was neither here nor there, but somewhere in between. A doorway, opening just a crack. I jerked my hand back, heart pounding. My reflection did the same, once again perfectly mimicking my movements, its momentary independence concealed behind the mask of normal physical laws. But I had felt it, the pathway, the possibility. And part of me, a growing part, wondered what might happen if, next time, I didn't pull away. If I allowed my hand to pass through, to grasp my reflection's offered hand, to step through the looking glass into whatever waited on the other side. Perhaps that day will come. Perhaps it is inevitable. For now, I continue my academic work, publishing papers on Egyptian mythology that carefully skirt the truths I have learned. I maintain a normal life, or the appearance of one, interacting with colleagues who never suspect that the man they speak with carries a piece of another realm within him. But each night, before I sleep, I stand before my mirror and study the thing that wears my face. Sometimes it merely watches me, patient and silent. Other times it smiles or beckons. Increasingly, I find myself smiling back. After all, we are bound together now, my reflection and I, bound to a curse that is slowly becoming something else entirely. Not an affliction, but a transformation, a doorway opening, one small crack at a time. And I wonder if, long ago, this was how the collector itself began, as a human who looked too deeply into the spaces between worlds until those spaces began to look back. If you want to hear more whispers from the darkness, subscribe to this channel. The next story might be closer than you imagine.